study on community-driven development programmes. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the report that will be coming out by the end of this year or early next year, and then Radhika will give a presentation focused on the inclusion of the disadvantaged communities and individuals in CDD programmes. That's the focus of the event today. In addition, Hugh Waddington, who has been moderating today, is also an author of this report. So first I want to talk about what community-driven development is. There's the definition we've got is up here. I have quite a lot of difficulty in coming with a definition I find acceptable. What I've got is community members are in charge of selecting and implementing and maintaining externally funded projects. The terminology normally used is something like community members are put in charge of their own development. And I find that very patronising. Community members are doing their own development every day without our help, thank you very much. So actually, we make it very clear that this is actually when the community-driven development, there's an externally funded project, but rather than NGOs being commissioned to come and run it for them, we actually say, okay, there's the money, take care of it, sort of thing. Though one thing we see is that over time, CDD programs have become more facilitated. So there's a greater degree of external representation. I was involved, this will become clear, in the evaluation of social fund programs very early on, which were early forms of CDD programs. And in those days, the ones in Africa were far more give the community the money, they get on with it. But now we see, particularly in the community reconstruction projects, I'm going to get off the pattern around. We see in the community reconstruction projects actually a lot of facilitation by NGOs being commissioned to facilitate the community process. But this is still the idea, the community selects the program and implements the project, some infrastructure of some sort normally, and then is responsible for maintenance as well. And the focus has been on small-scale infrastructure, particularly schools, health clinics, wash, roads, that sort of thing. So these are small-scale projects done down at community level, very often in rural areas, with the community being in charge of managing that sub-project, getting the funds paid into an account that's managed by a community committee. These have become very popular, particularly with the World Bank. So there are over 400 CDD projects in total in 94 countries with over $30 billion. So this is a big chunk of development money going to these. One estimate is around 1.3 billion a year during the first decade of this century. So the question we want to know is does CDD work? So we've done a review, a systematic review to look at whether CDD works or not, and we include programs in the review where there's an impact evaluation. So as a review of effectiveness, so we do a review of effectiveness, you can only include programs where there's an impact evaluation that's actually assessed the impact of the program on the outcomes of interest. We'll come to that on a bit. And it had to be a community-driven program that said it involved the whole community, so it couldn't be targeted at particular groups in the community. It devolved financial management to those communities. That's a key part of the CDD approach, rather than the CBD approach, which is community-based development. The projects had to be really public goods type projects, not individual goods or even group goods. Some projects do group goods, say farmers groups or women's groups. We were really looking at projects focused on public goods. And that narrows it down quite a bit because as CDD's evolved, it's been used for more and more things. So I have CDD, CCT programs, for example, just to be like acronyms, so let's do that. And they usually have some sort of multi-sectoral menu. So the community gets to choose what to do. There may be a positive list. There's normally a negative list, for example, against building religious buildings. So in Afghanistan, for example, they couldn't build mosques and often wanted to, and so the program was seen as like somehow imposing Christianity. Those are like black in Bangladesh, because they weren't allowed to build mosques. But there will be a positive list and sometimes a negative list of goods, but they're often public goods. The review we've done is a mixed method causal chain synthesis, which means in addition to the impact evaluations we collected, we then collected project documents and process evaluations for the interventions identified in the included studies. So we do an implementation review along the causal chain using qualitative process evaluation type evidence, and I thought there was a question about earlier on. And I do think in the in the evidence space, in the systematic review space, we're going to see a growing number of implementation reviews being done. So the programs that we did had a search strategy, and we identified 23 programs in 21 countries. There are a number in Indonesia in particular, multiple programs that we included, of which 5 are in post-conflict countries and 6 in where there's some conflict. So using community-driven reconstruction programs has been an important development in the last 10 to 15 years, and I won't have time to go into the detail in this presentation, but quite a lot of the variation we see across programs comes from the CDD versus CDR, community reconstruction projects, a bit different in the way they're designed, implemented, and so on. And there's been a stronger I'll come to that second, I guess. So, so in addition to these 25 impact evaluations we looked at, so there are 25 impact evaluations, I mentioned that. 25 impact evaluations covering 23 programs in all countries, and we looked at nearly 100 program documents, project documents, process evaluations linked to those 23 programs that we were looking at. So the coding of the project document allows us to say what are the objectives of these programs. Impact evaluations don't often go back to actually address what were the program objectives in a systematic way. The project documents, of course, do. So we know that the poverty reduction is a primary objective of these programs. Creation of public infrastructure is often stated. Decentralisation and improved governance started to come along during the early 2000s, a bit in the late 90s, particularly in the 2000s. We saw this. Social cohesion also started being a focus during the 2000s. And actually, also on this one, the move to decentralisation was earlier, but focus on governance, particularly democratisation, is much more recent focus. Similarly, social cohesion, it was there, but if you look at the timing of objectives, if you have a chronology in the report, you'll see that these sort of soft objectives of social cohesion and democracy and so have grown in importance over time, so more recent projects see that more as a focus, whereas earlier projects see it more around infrastructure and traditional more poverty reduction. So of course we're going to assess the programs against their achievement of these different objectives. So here's a simplified theory of change. We have a much more complicated one looking more like the figure that Charlotte showed in her talk this morning. So this is the simplified one, seeing two main effects basically, that the communities get this grant and facilitation, they run the project, and there's a learning by doing effect that leads to improved social cohesion. So the idea is that through the process of doing the project as a community, the community will say, well, that's a good idea, let's do another one of those of our initiative without the external support. Some valuations take that as an outcome indicator. Did they do a follow-on project of their own accord, which obviously outcome indicator to take, but not so many did. Evaluators did that. Most evaluations tried to use measures of social cohesion with increasing levels of sophistication. So more recent studies measure it through behavioural games and so on. Earlier ones use trust indicators and the like. But also learning by doing for improved governance. And then on the public good gets created, so it could be a road, school, health centre, so we expect to see improved socio-economic outcomes as a result. It's a very crude overview of the theory of change. There are some underlying assumptions, of course, that the community does indeed participate in all stages of the project. There's no elite capture, so taking the benefits away from the community as a whole, and the community comes together on equal footing, again, which is rather related to this, but it may not be elite, it may be particular subgroups, ethnic groups or whatever, might dominate the proceedings, present the improvement in governance and social cohesion and so on. So I'm going straight to results. It's a very short presentation. I'm skipping over a lot of the richness of the report. We do see improved facilities. So this is education facilities, and this is a forest plot. You see there's a lot of systematic reviews, and in a forest plot, each row corresponds to a study. So I said we had 23 studies, but of those, only 7 are reporting an outcome indicator related to education facilities. So not every forest plot includes every study. And in a forest plot, the horizontal line is the confidence interval at 95%, and the vertical line is the line of no effect. So if the horizontal line crosses the vertical line, that study found no effect. If it doesn't, it ties to the right of a line, and Charlotte had these for a simple study, then there's a positive effect. And the diamond is a meta-analysed effect size, which is an inverse variance weighted average of the overall effect size and overall effect. And if the diamond doesn't cross the line, then the average effect size is yes, there's an improvement or decrease of that indicator. So here we do see that overall CDD programs do increase education facilities. We see the same for health facilities. There's quite a lot of variation, and I'll comment on that in a second. There are quite a few evaluation issues, research design issues, and CDD evaluations. I'm not going to discuss them in general here, but here I will mention one of them. So here we've taken these data and we've split it down into controlled study designs. So where they've got a comparison group and they're doing either an ex post single difference or double difference with the control design, or where we've got a control before versus after study. So just measuring the indicator before versus after, and we see the improvement, big improvements, coming from the uncontrolled before versus after indicators. And we'd normally say, well, you usually get an effect from before versus after, you don't get when you put in a control group, and that's why we need a control group. I would say, think what you're measuring before you say whether you want to have a control group or not. All we want to know here is, did actually rehabilitating or building a new school in a community improve the presence, the availability of education facilities in that community? That's what before versus after tells you. So actually before versus after is a perfectly valid, sensible measure in this case. And here we see the effect. If you compare with the control community, what do you know? There's nothing happening compared to the control community. That can mean one of two things. It might mean there's also investments going on in the comparison communities, so everyone's improving. Your community got a better score, but so did the comparison community. We don't know, because we haven't got data on the comparison community to tell us that, because we didn't collect it, it's not reported in the study, or there was no improvement. So actually there was investment, but there was for some reason no improvement. And we don't know which of those that is in most of these cases. So in our review, when we get the forest plot, we actually go through every line and try and interpret it. And basically, in this case, we don't know, because most reports don't report what happened in comparison communities. But the main point is, you shouldn't use a counterfactual for this question. You should use a factual. So people will try to be a bit too clever by half, often, and in the end, ends up not answering the question you want to answer. So we don't know the answer, but on average, we do see this improvement in facilities. I'm not going to go in detail on the outcomes. Basically, overall, there's no effect on education outcomes. There isn't health outcomes, but education outcomes, we'll see it in a moment. But again, we looked at the details, and there's no effect overall. In the cases where there was an effect, the project wasn't just supplying infrastructure, it was also supplying, say, school uniforms, for example. Or there was an effect in Afghanistan, but actually there was no school building in Afghanistan. So it wasn't coming from the school building, it was coming from the effect on encouraging girls that girls should go to school, and it's okay for girls to go to school, which wasn't an infrastructure investment. And so in this review, we did really try to unpack the forest plots to explain the variation in this qualitative way, using the qualitative information we had from the studies. But the main finding, or a main finding, is there is no impact on social cohesion. And we've got a lot of studies that talk about social cohesion, and they're down the line, on the vertical line, no heterogeneity, no variation, no outliers. That doesn't affect social cohesion. This is not a new finding. I was part of the team who did the social funds evaluation at the World Bank back in the late 90s, published in 2002. No impact on social funds or social cohesion. IEG did no report on CDD projects mid-2000s, 2006, I think. No effect on social cohesion. There's now a number of RCTs, including some done by IRC. No effect on social cohesion. There's one exception in Liberia, but basically when you combine those also, no effect on social cohesion. This is not a new finding, it's not a dubious finding, it's a really strong, robust finding. These things do not improve social cohesion, and people should just give up on that and say that doesn't happen. Okay, that's not why we're doing this, but it doesn't work. And this is one of those things where you don't say more research is needed. More research is not needed, people. We know the answer. Okay. Also, improved governance. Okay, it's not. There's less evidence there, but when you look at and we try to disaggregate between if the grid is appointed or elected, but basically there's no effect anywhere anyway. So improved governance, also not there. There's no effect on these sort of indicators. Here's an overall matrix. So we coded about 1,500 effect sizes, a lot of effect sizes, a lot of coding. And we broke them down by stages of the causal chain and by the different sectors. We soon realised that any meta-analysis, any average effect across the rows by sector made no sense because you're meta-analysing across different things, but it did make sense to actually meta-analysis across the causal chain categories. And what you see if you do that is you do get a positive effect on facilities, but you don't have much elsewhere, apart from you do get these outcomes on health and wash, not on education. So there does feed through on the health side, which is good. It doesn't feed through, of course, on social cohesion. There's nothing happening there. So that's, I mean, these are pretty strong, robust findings, I think, from the effects of these interventions. And what I want to do is, in this presentation, and more in Radhika's and mine, is talk about why do we see these effects. I'm going to talk about it very briefly. So CDD programs often usually construct and rehabilitated very large numbers, this is the point, very large numbers of facilities, often in rural areas, including remote rural areas, not exceeding their targets. So for example, Afghanistan, in the first phase, there were 65,000 projects. So back in, and so there's more examples, in Zambia they built 3,000 classroom blocks, in Malawi 2,700, and in Honduras by 260,000 deaths. These are large numbers, okay? Back in the mid-90s, a colleague of mine at the bank, Wale, and I tried to put together a document. They had this thing called poverty-oriented projects in the early 90s at the bank. We tried to put together a document counting what they'd actually done in terms of outputs. And it was difficult because in those days no one actually recorded outputs. But when we did, it'd be like, we had $20 million and we rehabilitated 3 schools. They were pathetic numbers, okay? So these things, and I was involved in evaluating this one in the field, they were out there. Wherever you went out in the countryside, you would see these blue and white schools that had been done by the social fund. They were really going out there and reaching down communities and creating social infrastructure out in rural areas. 8 projects have historically been very bad at actually getting out to rural areas. These CDD programs are really succeeding in that. So you do see large amounts of infrastructure being rehabilitated very often, particularly schools, but not new schools, they're rehabilitating schools. That explains why you see less effect on enrolments, because not new schools as better schools. And again, also health centres, which are more commonly new rather than rehabilitated. So there are large numbers, and that's why you do see the effect on facilities. There is an effect on facilities if programs really are doing a lot. But when it comes to participation, you have something like the funnel of attrition. The basic idea of the funnel of attrition is if every 100 people you expect to benefit from a program, maybe around less than 10 do. Now, this is just in the nature of having a causal chain. If you have a causal chain and the transmission from each stage to the next is 80%, by the third link you're down to 50%. 80 by 80 by 80, you get down to 80, so 64, 80 times 64 is roughly 50. Then you're down to 40, then you're down to 32, and so on. So you have this attrition just by the nature of probabilistic relationships rather than determinative relationships in your causal chain. It's just inherent. But what we've got here is causal evidence based on factual data, knowing the proportion of the response in a community who knew the meeting took place, had heard of the project, aware of the meeting, contributed to the project, attended the meeting, spoke at the meeting, and aware of the cost of the project, if you think that'd be their involved in management at all. And it just goes down. So, and each dot is data from a different project. So we see that very high numbers of people knew there was a meeting. Some would know it's because of a particular project. But when we get down to speaking of the project, we're down in around 10% range. So most people are not actively taking part in actually making decisions around this project. It's the project committees that do that. It's not the community meeting as a whole. So people participate in making bricks to make the buildings. They don't participate in making the decisions. And so you don't see the process that's meant to take place to build social cohesion in order to go on to follow projects. You don't see that happening. So despite the fact that CDD programs may pay explicit attention to including the poor, the disadvantaged and so on, they actually don't get engaged. So these mechanisms are generally not being terribly effective. So why is this? So that's going to speak about that. While you're getting ready, I will just have more adverts. So GIS is our big event next year. Sign up for 3i newsletter, and there's an event tomorrow on evidence mapping, also organised by Evidence Aid. In the afternoon, I forget what it is, I can tell you, go there as well.
I decided to focus this presentation more on program design elements that affect the participation of poor and marginalized, that affect the benefits for poor and marginalized. So a key aspect of that is targeting, and you see that many implementers, particularly social funds, use geographic targeting. So they use poverty maps to target poor communities. And so these poverty maps are based on, household income or household expenditure data. So they use these kind of indices. But what you see is that over a period of time, the use of these maps have helped more progressive distribution of resources for poorer communities. Implementers have adopted more pro-poor goals. They've had more outreach, and in general, this has seemed to have helped in reaching out to poor and marginalized communities. But there are certain aspects of program design which affect targeting. So there are two types of CDD programs. So there's one type where the communities are meant to apply for funding, and there's another type where the implementer agency just decides to allocate and select the communities. But where the communities have to apply, there the onus is on the implementing agency to sort of raise awareness, and then if the community doesn't hear about the program, they won't apply for it. So in Zambia, they use the Headmasters Conference as an outreach channel. So the teachers heard about it. And so in a way, it's interesting that the elite or the prime movers in the community then play a key role in applying for funding, and they may have a key role in deciding which projects. This may or may not be a good or a bad thing, but that's the way it is. It's the prime movers within the community taking those decisions. But overall, because of the types of projects that are funded by CDD programs, it's schools, community health centers, it's a lot of public infrastructure that benefits the entire community. So unless the community decides that they want to fund the construction of latrines, then individuals may benefit more than communities. A little bit about the targeting of community-driven reconstruction programs, because these are in conflict-affected areas. And this can be a sensitive process because, in Indonesia, for instance, in Aceh, the community was expected to identify conflict victims and ex-combatants, and this became very contentious. So the communities started saying, no, I think the grants should be distributed to the entire community, not just ex-combatants or conflict victims. So it can be contentious. In Afghanistan, again, the definition of community, when it becomes a geographic one, that becomes problematic because there are different ethnic groups within the community. They don't agree to come together and be part of this community development council. Again, it becomes problematic. Overall, we find that very little evidence of how targeting influences who benefits from the program. But going through all the project documents, it's very clear that targeting is so very important and much more needs to be done on this. Another key aspect is facilitation. I mean, this goes hand in hand with any CDD program. But we find so much of variation in the nature and intensity of facilitation across these programs. It could be an NGO doing the facilitation, it could be community members doing the facilitation, it could be the government. Sometimes it could be just a single facilitator looking after multiple villages. In other cases, it has been a dedicated team. So Kekamatin Development Program in Indonesia is an excellent example where they had multiple levels of facilitation. So at the village, there was a male and female facilitator, and at the sub-district level, there was a technical facilitator who looked after all the technical infrastructure quality, budgets, all of that, and then there was a social facilitator. So that's the deep level of facilitation involved. And in the facilitators, if you look at their job description, they really are these overworked individuals because they have to generate awareness, disseminate information, appoint the committees, hold elections, mobilize community members, train them. So there's a lot that they do to facilitate this process of getting the poor and the marginalized to participate. Facilitation has been used to increase participation of marginalized. So in Sierra Leone, for instance, they divide the community into different groups: women, youth, men. They had to make their own development plans. So there you see facilitation has a key role. DRC and Liberia are interesting examples of where they had put together an advisory board which had very diverse members. So to ensure diverse representation of interests, so religious leaders, government officials, women and youth leaders. But then again, you see there's really no evidence on the impact of how facilitation improves the participation of different groups, although the project documents have so much rich information. Sorry, Umar, I think I'm going to take another 5 minutes at least.
Last one.
All right. Again, community contributions to projects are, again, a very important aspect of CDD programs. This could be in cash, kind, or both. In most cases, it's mandatory. In some cases, it's involuntary, but in most cases, it has been mandatory. It could range between 5 and 50% of the project cost, but on average, it's about 25%. And the required contribution could also vary depending on the ability to pay. So in Armenia, for instance, it was set at 10%, but then it was reduced to 5% for very poor communities. So community contribution has been used to build ownership and mobilize resources, and you do see that the unit cost of these projects goes down substantially when the community has managed it, the community has contributed to it, but poorer households may be better able to contribute labor rather than cash. So in Indonesia, you find that it's the few wealthy people who've contributed a lot of cash, and then a lot of poor people who've contributed labor, and that's more widespread. Again, it may bias allocation towards better off communities and groups, and poorer groups may have less access to funds. So for instance, in Nigeria, where they had to make contributions to acquire private goods, often the poor got into rental agreements with the rich, took loans from them to make the contribution. And some of the projects which were for women and the vulnerable never got implemented because they couldn't make the contribution. So here again, very crucial aspect of CDD programs which can affect participation of poor and marginalized, but there's not much evidence on seeing how this affects the quality of participation. Finally, looking at approaches that are being used to increase women's participation, and this is really important, and Howard showed you the funnel of attrition. It looks somewhat similar for women, only that the numbers are much, much lower. And most of these programs do encourage women to participate in meetings and be part of project committees. Some of them have rules and measures to mandate the number of women who should be in a meeting, the number of women who should be part of project committees. But the few studies we have show that the inclusion of women, this sort of mandatory inclusion, may not help a lot in the short term. So in DRC, for instance, the impact evaluation showed that both the controlled communities and the treatment communities, women constitute about 30% of the project committee, so it didn't make much of a difference. In Yemen, the requirement was not enforced, so although 2 out of 5 project committee members were meant to be women, often the number was lower. In Afghanistan, they find that often the male relatives were controlling the voting decisions of the women. So studies don't really capture the quality of participation of women, and more importantly, how this is empowering women economically, politically, socially, and whether they actually feel more empowered in the public sphere after these programs are implemented. So, of course, there are lots of cultural norms, last 2 slides, cultural norms and social, last 2 slides. Cultural norms and social economic factors that influence participation of women. This seems like a truism. There's the opportunity cost of attending meetings, illiteracy, family responsibilities, all of these are barriers to women's participation. But I'd like to end with a good example, which is the Keka Madam Development Program, which is run on for several years. And again, based on process evaluations, you find that the engagement of women and attendance in meetings has really increased over the long term. But then as you take a closer look, you realize that there's so many measures that were put in place to increase the participation of women. So separate meeting invites went out to women, and that's important. It starts there, inviting them separately. One proposal came from a women's group, so that was mandatory. Intense facilitation to ensure the poor and marginalized women, so women who are single women who are heads of households. The facilitation involved preventing elite women from dominating discussions, appointment of women as village facilitators, and ensuring that 50% representation of every village delegation were women. A microfinance component for projects. So finally, we find that there are several, this is the last 30 seconds, I promise you. There are several design elements that can affect the participation of the poor and the marginalized and the benefits that go to them. There's clearly an urgent need that, for examining the impact of different design elements. There's so many design elements, but there's not much evidence. There's considerable variability in the designs of CDD programs. And finally, it's really important for us to learn from several good examples out there.
Okay, so, I mean...
Was that before you heard from the staff?
No, actually, I skimmed through the report.
Well, I think as we started a little late, maybe we can give you like 8 minutes.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
So when I got the email, to be part of this panel to talk about CDD, I'm like, oh my God, CDD, of all topics. Because even within IRC, you have 3 schools of thought, right? You have the believers of CDD, mostly people in the field that have been involved in implementing the project. They tell you that, oh, how come you're saying that it doesn't work? You build schools, you build clinics and all that. And you have the atheists, people that just say we should stop doing it because the evidence says it doesn't work. Then you have the third group, which are the agnostics, people that say that just because the evidence says it doesn't work, it might actually be that it might work in, a different, context and depending on how it is designed, which I'll come to later. But I just want to, talk about our experience with the Tungani project in DRC, in DR Congo, which, was referenced in your report. So we did the impact evaluation, and when I joined IRC in 2012, that was when the impact evaluation, that period just came out, and everyone was surprised that there was no positive effect on social cohesion, and I was surprised as well. And I'm thinking to myself that, hang on a minute, you think a community-driven development program is going to build social cohesion? I mean, a 2, 3-year, 4-year program is going to build social cohesion in a post-conflict environment where these communities have been in conflict for decades. And suddenly you think a 2 or 3-year project of building stuff is going to build social cohesion. I mean, it's not rocket science, that's not going to happen. So the idea that, this project is going to build social cohesion and improve local governance was, I think, not, it was unrealistic from the start, so that there are no surprises at all. But for IRC, when we first designed the first Tungani project, there was no explicit theory of change. The idea was to just build stuff, and somehow that would, promote local governance, the decentralization, issue, social cohesion, and the spillover effect, maybe welfare gains, poverty reduction, and all that. But we now did a qualitative exercise with our staff in 2012, asking them what their understanding of the project was, and various people gave various, they were different understanding, even amongst our staff, and that was simply because we didn't have an explicit theory of change from the beginning. Some thought that, oh yes, we built infrastructure, that's good, great, I don't care about social cohesion, I don't care about governance. And some thought, oh, actually it improved participation. I see participation by itself, is something that they were most interested in. So what we then did, and the other thing that we did was we created this parallel village development committees that were not rooted in existing structures within those communities. So even before the results of the evaluation came out, a lot of our staff, a lot of us knew that this was not a good idea. The initial design was flawed. And so the second phase, they decided to make some changes. So one of the changes was that the second phase of the project was designed specifically to improve service delivery. So it was more targeted. There was an explicit theory of change on that, and it also focused on working with existing community structures rather than creating parallel structures. And some of the results of that, is mixed as well, but at least there's some promising results around, supporting interface between users of services and providers of services, improvements around accountability, transparency, and perception of service delivery. But the evaluation result can also be interpreted, as confirming that these types of programs have significant limitations in terms of influence. So one of it is there's a collective action ceiling. There's a limit to what the communities can achieve themselves, even around service delivery. So let's take, for example, you build a school, okay, fine. You work with the district education board, they're involved in the project and all that. But if the teachers are not paid, there's nothing the communities can do about that. The best we can do is advocacy towards higher levels of government at the province level or the national level. Now, depending on the governance structure in the country, whereby teachers are recruited by the Ministry of Education from Kinshasa and deployed to the field, the communities cannot influence that beyond just advocacy. So even though you've built the school, you've worked with the local authorities, the teachers are still not paid, which means there's going to be absenteeism. They're not going to turn up. They're going to do other stuff because they need alternative source of income, to feed their family. So that's one, limitation, the collective action ceiling. And this goes back to what, Jonathan Fox, talks about in social accountability strategies, that it's not just about focusing at the bottom-up level, you also have to do the top-down as well. So if you're just implementing projects at the community level without looking at the macro picture, what's happening at the national level and the province level, and you connect those two, you will run into problems, what we call the sandwich approach, the top-down and bottom-up. So then, okay, one last point around that is, then I'll just recall. Program impact of CDD have, there's a boundary effect. So boundary partners, people that were, and we're alluding to this in your presentation, people that were involved in the decision-making process towards the end, right, they have positive response, to the project. But the wider community itself might have different, responses to the effectiveness of the project. So at the IRC, what we are saying right now is we need to be clear on what we're trying to achieve. What outcomes are we trying to achieve? Then we need to also be explicit about the assumptions that we're making and program towards those assumptions in terms of the activities that you implement, to meet those assumptions. So if you're assuming that women or a minority ethnic group is going to participate, do you have specific activities in place to ensure that that happens and that happens meaningfully? So, and we've, my senior technical director and research and evaluation and learning advisor, Sherry Bennett, have written a paper on this. Then one last point, and I'll stop. On evaluation methods. I mean, a lot of the stuff that you guys talked about, it's absolutely, it aligns with what we're learning, and what we're seeing in IRC as well. But there's also a need, for mixed methods and qualitative methods. They remain underused in CDD and CDR evaluation. There's a need for more of that, which enables us to better understand under which conditions can specific outcomes be achieved. And we need to think about how do we use political economy analysis, social network analysis, to better unpack existing power dynamics and occurring, within the community-driven process. So, for example, process tracing, having an in-depth analysis of single cases to make inferences about the causal mechanisms, to test the realistic pathways for change. In other words, we need to have a better understanding of the contextual dynamics.